Okay, so last time I spoke about some of the signs of the times, especially in relation to what's happening here, in relation to the COVID, in relation to all the economic crisis and so on. This time I'm going to look at pretty well exclusively about Israel and the Middle East. Just before I get into it, I do want to just go back to the present situation. One of the things I said last time, if you remember, I quoted a German man called Ernst Wolff, who gave an analysis, I believe, of the, from a secular point of view, not from a Christian point of view, but he analysed the world situation in a way which points totally towards the Revelation 13 Mark of the Beast system. He sort of analysed how it's going to come about. He didn't say that, but that was my conclusion of what he was saying. One of the things he said was about the situation in the world. He said, as a result of the lockdowns, we have a severe economic crisis to manage. Global logistics are on the floor, supply chains are broken, harvests are being lost, food supply bottlenecks are on, and on top of this, we're seeing a scarcity of vital semiconductors. Problems are not being addressed and solved, but multiplied and magnified by the application of further measures and constant threats of new restrictions. That was 2 weeks ago, and you've seen it happening around the world in a more intense way in the last 2 weeks. About this energy crisis, about the petrol, it's only kind of one of many things which are coming on the world of shortages. Apparently we don't have a shortage of petrol, but we do have a shortage of drivers to get the petrol from A to B. I don't know if you've sat for hours trying to get petrol. I haven't, because I managed to fill up before it started, but it's kind of a sign in a way of the beginning of a breakdown. Many government ministers are actually bracing themselves for coming energy chaos, not just of petrol, but of fuel to keep the system going, gas, and so on. And it's all leading to shortages all around, shortages of food, shortages of various things which need to keep the system going. Apparently farmers are destroying food because they can't get it to the shops on time. And you can expect price rises to rise, and shortages, and inflation and rising poverty. Some of the things I picked up from one article in the paper said petrol stations being closed because there are not enough drivers to effectively distribute to all of the petrol stations. Shortage of natural gas causing a spike in gas bills for millions of Britons, along with the possibility of dozens of small energy firms going bust. Ministers say there's no question of the lights going out, of people being unable to heat their homes. There'll be no 3-day working week or a throwback to the 1970s, which probably means there will be. Shortage of natural gas is leading to closures of fertiliser plants which produce CO2 used in drinks and the meat industry. Lorry driver shortage which is crippling the UK's transport industry, leaving empty shelves and slow delivery times. It's not just here. In the EU, energy prices are going through the roofs, factories are beginning to close, and food is disappearing from the shelves. Article here says the crisis in Europe presages trouble for the rest of the planet as the continent's energy shortage has governments warning of blackouts and factories being forced to shut. Apparently they're praying that we're going to have a warm winter, that global warming's true and it'll be mild. If it's not mild, then you can have a real problem of supply of energy in the coming winter. I think you're going to have a cold winter actually, but there we are. In the US, it says supply chains are in a state of complete and utter chaos. This is driving up prices, causing widespread shortages all over the country. International Chamber of Commerce of shipping and under-industry groups warn of a global transport system collapse. Governments don't restore freedom of movement to transport workers. Things are particularly bad at our ports. Right now, there is a backlog of approximately 500,000 shipping containers waiting on ships off the west coast, waiting to be unloaded. Estimated 500,000. Most Americans don't realize that this is the backlog off the coast of China. Is even worse. Number of container ships off Shanghai and Ningbo has surged over the recent weeks. There are now 242 container ships waiting for berths countrywide, and rising congestion in China, another wild card for trade. I don't know if you've seen these ships. I remember I once went on a boat trip from Harwich to Felixstowe to the container port, and you see these massive ships from China. I mean, they're like a huge city. It's unbelievable how big they are. And when they get into the docks, there's they have like cranes, which somebody's sitting They don't have workers on it. They're just somebody sitting in an office pressing a button. The thing goes down, picks up the container, and then puts it straight onto a lorry, which then takes it up to wherever it's going, to the Midlands or somewhere. It's unbelievable to watch it happening. And you think in the past, when dockers went onto boats, there was hundreds of people going on to unload them. Just one person pressing a button, getting all this stuff off. Now, at the moment, it's not happening because the ships are they're not getting through. So you have a huge backlog of stuff all over the world of things getting through. And it's going to build up unless something really drastic happens. Now, in China itself, industrial production has ground to a halt. Traffic lights have stopped functioning because there's a lack of electricity. Half of China's provincial jurisdictions mandate rationing of electricity. Poor communication and unclear timeline, leaving the angry public in the dark. One local government warns that entire power grid is at risk of collapse if the electricity is not rationed. Past 6 months, 16 out of 31 provincial jurisdictions, from industrial powerhouses in the south to the Rust Belt in the north, have rolled out electricity rationing measures, triggering widespread alarm among much of the population and plunging the nation's industrial sector into chaos. Factories are closed, traffic chaos as the traffic light system fails. So we think of China as this great powerhouse that is pulling it all, falling down in China as well. So you're seeing this thing happening all over the world, like a kind of gradual collapse of the world system. So where's it going to end up? Will they fix it? Well, politicians hope they will, but if they don't, you'd expect to see growing shortages and a growing crisis economically all over the world, which could lead to the weakening of the global economy and the system crashing. If it crashes, then you move into some kind of totalitarian government to sort it out, which is what you could see humming in line of prophecy. So we're in a kind of dangerous situation, really. I was thinking in the Revelation where it speaks about the fall of Babylon, and out of Babylon comes the Antichrist, the beast, and the false prophet, and they bring in this kind of world government system. Now, we're not there yet, but you can see everything's kind of falling little by little. I was reminded when I was at school, we read a book called The Machine Stops by a writer called E.M. Forster. It was a sort of thing of the prophecy, not a prophecy, it was a novel, just a novel, but it's about the future. I think it was written before the First World War, so it's quite an old book. But everyone's living in this sort of very highly technical machine system. They have everything they need, everything's provided for them. They just press a button and it all comes through. And they have a little book called the Book of the Machine, which they kind of worship like a Bible. And there's this lad called Kuno who comes along and he says, one day, the machine stops. I said, what are you talking about? It's like, it can't possibly happen. He says, I know it, the machine stops. And little by little, everything starts stopping until the whole thing falls apart and they have to get out of the machine and then sort of fend for themselves. But I thought it was kind of prophetic, really, that you see this great technical machine system which has been built up, and little by little it starts to fall down. When it falls down, boom, what happens next? You move into the time which the Bible speaks about, the end times of the Great Tribulation, the rise of the Antichrist, and the world government system which comes out of chaos in order to bring in some kind of order and hope for the people, which also breaks down until Jesus comes back. Now, if you take the pre-tribulation view, which I do, we won't be around for the worst of the time. But the fact you can see things happening now is an indication that we're moving in that direction. So let's move on, because I didn't really want to speak about that, but I just thought, as the things are happening, it kind of struck me as being relevant to our subject. But tonight I really want to talk about Israel, and the theme really is Israel in danger. If you do take the Bible literally, which I do, then there has to be something happening in the Middle East which is going to turn us to the second coming of Jesus, which is related to the return of the Jews to Israel. And we look at this picture of Jerusalem. It reminds us that Jerusalem is at the center of world events in the last days. In the book of Zechariah, it says that Jerusalem is going to be a burdensome stone, burdening all nations. There's going to be some kind of a crisis revolving around Jerusalem, which will involve all the nations of the world and which will cause them to focus on this city in the Judean hills. and particularly on this particular area. If you look at this area here, you have a picture of the Dome of the Rock Mosque and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the one down at the south end with the silver dome, which is on the Temple Mount, which is where in Bible times the Temple of Solomon stood, the second temple stood, the place where Jesus went into the temple, right there on the Temple Mount. Now it has a Muslim shrine on it. Actually, in that golden dome with the Muslim shrine, there's a text which says, "Say not that Allah has a son," and puts a curse on anyone who says that Allah has a son. So who believes that Allah or God has a son? Christians. So right there, standing in the holy place, you've got an Antichrist text telling you to curse basically the Christians. Interesting, isn't it? And that building has to be higher than the other buildings round about it to show the supremacy of Islam. And it was one of the first mosques ever built, that one there. And they believe, the Muslims believe that Muhammad ascended to heaven on a horse from the Silver Dome Mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And as he went up into heaven, he encountered all the prophets, including Jesus, and they told him he was on the right track and he was the right prophet for the last days. And that's one of their stories. Unfortunately, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built at least 50 years after Muhammad died, 700 miles away from where he lived. So how they get this story together, even if, I mean, obviously it's a fantasy, but the whole thing doesn't add up. But it's one of their stories, and that's why, as far as Islam is concerned, this particular building is the third holiest place after Mecca and Medina. So from the Islamic point of view, it has to be under the control of the Muslims. If it's under the control of the Jews, then it's a problem. And since 1967, when Israel was formed in 1948, this whole area of the old city of Jerusalem was in the Jordanian side, so it was under Arab Muslim control. In 1967, when Israel took control of the old city of Jerusalem and the area called the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, Israel took control of this area and it became under Israeli control. Israel then said that Jerusalem is our holiest city and we're not going to withdraw from it, so they made Jerusalem the undivided capital of the state of Israel. As far as Islam is concerned, that's something which goes right against the grain. If any place has been Islamic for one time, it has to remain Islamic. And so if it goes to the Jews and the Jews start saying that this is their capital, their city, then it goes against Islamic belief. Okay, if you look on the next slide, next one. Yeah, that's the Western Wall. So the Western Wall is just by the old city, by the Dome of the Rock. It's on the western side of the Temple Mount, and it's the place where Jewish people go to worship God and congregate for their the most holy place in Judaism. So if the Dome of the Rock is the third holiest place for the Muslims, the place which we see there, the Western Wall, is the holiest place for Jewish people. And when the Jewish Israelis took control of the old city of Jerusalem, they stood at the Western Wall and said, "We've regained our holiest places, never again to depart from them." And if you add all that together, you have a statement of the situation which is going to be in the last days concerning Israel and Jerusalem. There's going to be a conflict over the status of who rules this area. And as far as Islam is concerned, it should be under Islamic control. Israel has control of it at this present time, although they have allowed the Muslims to control the Temple Mount area, so that the area where the Dome of the Rock is still under the Waqf, as it's called, the Muslim control, and Israel has control of the area down below. The big item for the world to consider is what should be the status of this place. So this particular area here is probably the most significant little piece of real estate you'll find anywhere in the world. Should it continue to be under Israeli control? Should it be the undivided capital of Israel? Should it be divided into the capital of Palestine and the capital of Israel on the western side? Should it even come under control of the United Nations? All kinds of proposals have been put forward. Nobody yet has solved it. But Zechariah says that this place is going to be the burdensome stone burdening all nations at the end of days. And you can see that it's happening now. Other prophecies in Jeremiah speak about the Jewish people returning to the land of Israel, and there being a time of trouble and of danger. And out of that time of trouble and danger, they're going to come to be corrected for something which they've got wrong. And the prophecy of Zechariah then goes on to say that when the armies gather together against Jerusalem in the last days, Israel is going to look upon him whom they've pierced and mourn for him for an only son. In other words, what they've got wrong is the identity of the Messiah. So Jeremiah, Zechariah, other prophecies speak about a time of Israel turning to the Messiah in the last days and looking to Jesus, believing that he is the Messiah. And then he comes back and stands on the Mount of Olives, which is just on the other side of the Temple Mount there, and sets up his messianic rule for the time of the millennial kingdom, or the time of the Messiah. So this is the situation. This is just a little brief rundown of what's happening. Now, I believe that we're living in the last days, and these things are pointing us towards the second coming of Jesus. Israel's just finished, and the Jewish people around here have just finished what they call the High Holy Days, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. Here's a group of Orthodox Jewish people getting their lulavs ready for, which is what they take to the sukkah, the booth, which they dwell in during the time of Sukkot. Sukkot is actually a joyful time in which they remember God's provision for Israel during the time when they came out of Egypt, went through the wilderness. It also, from the biblical point of view, looks forward to the time when the Messiah is going to reign on the earth and bring peace and justice to the earth. So they've just been through these Jewish festivals. Sukkot actually ends with a festival called Simchat Torah, in which the whole of the Torah, the Torah is the 5 books of Moses. Last of the 5 books of Moses is read, and they go back to the cycle to begin with Genesis. And even non-religious Jewish people keep some of these feasts, especially Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And this year they've kept them as normal in Jerusalem and around the world. It's a time when Jewish people can sort of renew their faith in God, in the family, hopefully forget something of the troubles of the world, and hope that God is going to look after them. But now they come back to the world and its problems. And Israel has to face a whole lot of troubles which are coming on the world. And I'm going to look at some of these this evening, and then we're going to finish looking at 1 or 2 passages from prophecy, which I believe are the world's heading towards. So, what are some of the dangers? 5 signs of dangers to Israel. One of them is actually the vaccine and the virus. Secondly, some of the things happening in the Palestinian Authority and relations with the Arabs, particularly in relation to Jerusalem. Thirdly, with the surrounding nations, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan and Egypt. And finally, the big one, which is Iran and the war of Gog and Magog. Okay, so we go through those quite quickly and just then finish by looking at some of the things which are happening in the world. So Israel, it has one of the most advanced countries with dealing with the COVID-19 and with the vaccine program. There's one of the stations which they do the vaccination in. And Israel's actually been called the world's real-life COVID-19 lab. In other words, people are looking at Israel and saying that Israel is a kind of test case for how to deal with the virus, test case about whether the vaccine works and how to deal with it. And so Israel's become a kind of a laboratory experiment, if you like, which all the nations are looking at, including the United States. There's a quote from here, a researcher in the US says, Israel is the model. It's pure mRNA vaccines. It's out there early. It's got a very high level of uptake. It's a working experimental lab for us all to learn from. So they're looking at Israel as a kind of laboratory to learn from. And Israel's Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, said, Israel is doing the world a great service with its vaccine policies. Without us, the world doesn't know what the exact efficacy levels of booster shots, wouldn't know the dates, how much they affect infections, and how they affect severe illnesses. The world is very happy that we're taking responsibility and lead in this manner. So he's acknowledging that Israel has become a kind of a test case. So is it going well for Israel? Is it all a good sign that the vaccines work and that we should rush off to take the vaccines and the booster shots and just trust in the vaccines that it's the answer? Actually, it's not going well at all. Israel has one of the world's highest levels of vaccination for COVID, and yet the country is now logging one of the world's highest infection rates. It's a bit strange, isn't it? If the vaccine's supposed to deal with the problem, how come they've got such a high infection rate? Nearly 650 new cases per million people every day. Most of these people who are getting it are fully vaccinated, stoking concerns that the effects of the vaccination ebb over the time. They're now saying that they have to have a third vaccination booster, and they have to recognise that the vaccine wanes after 6 months. And if you're in Israel now and you are open to have the third vaccine, then you're not considered vaccinated unless you've had the third one. So being double vaccinated is not enough. You have to have the third one, the booster shot. In fact, as of today, the vaccine passport, as of today, the October the 3rd, Israelis, that's the picture of the passport they're using in Israel, the green pass to get in and out of shops and out of even synagogues and places of worship. As of today, Israelis who are otherwise fully vaccinated against COVID but haven't yet received their booster shot will lose their green passport. In terms of effectiveness, the vaccine is only valid for a period of 5 or 6 months. After about half a year, you have to get a third dose, otherwise the vaccine loses its power. And they hope that the mass vaccinations will break the chain of infection and bring an end to the waves of infection. But even the World Health Organization is actually saying it's not so, and they're discouraging the third booster shot. So you've got about 2.15 million Israelis who've now received the third shot, the booster shot. And yet Israel have this very high infection rate. So what does that tell you? It tells me actually that there's a lot of danger in all of this. And Israel is unfortunately being used as a kind of experimental country. See how it goes. And the Israelis themselves are administering it, which is kind of sad to me. Now, there's a lot of opposition which is growing. Here's actually a demonstration in Tel Aviv against the vaccine. Rather fierce-looking lady there holding up her banner. I'm not sure what the Hebrew says. Any Hebrew experts can tell you what the banners say? Anyway, it's a protest against vaccination. And I've listened to a series of testimonies from Israelis about negative experiences they've had with the vaccine. Blood clots, healthy young people who have been incapacitated, some even died. Allergic reactions, women having unnatural periods, some even losing babies. People report being very tired, unable to walk after the shots. And what's happening is that none of this is being reported in the media. It's all being kind of suppressed, so nobody knows about it. And instead, actually, the non-vaccinated are held up for attack. So you have people in the media saying it's all those horrible people who don't get vaccinated who are responsible for the troubles. But actually, it's not that way. And some of the critics are saying that Israel is now becoming like a medical police state, in which people who are unvaccinated are being banned from public spaces if they haven't had the third dose of the vaccine, which I find really sad because actually, one other thing, it means I can't go to Israel at the present time. But you have this kind of tremendous pressure in Israel to take the vaccine. And I wonder what it's all about. One of the other interesting things is that in the Palestinian Authority areas, they've only had about 10% of the people vaccinated. Much less than Israel, very much less. And yet in Israel, you had a massive spike in COVID cases. And within the Palestinian areas, it's dropped, even though people have only had 10% of the vaccines. So again, what does that tell you? It doesn't add up. Now, I know sometimes people think I go on about this too much, but to me it's one of the big dangers which is facing Israel today. And one of the people who's opposed to it, Dr. Feinstein, he says he's opposed to the vaccination program and is part of a spontaneous organization of citizens that compromised doctors, lawyers and academics responsible to violations of human rights in Israel. Interview with Israel Today, he said, after the violations were committed amid the lockdowns and mask mandating, the injection issue began, and I as a doctor understood that something unethical, illegal and dangerous is being done here. This danger made me go out as an activist. I felt that I'm in danger, my family's in danger, my people is in danger, and finally humanity is in danger. Pfizer admits that we in Israel are the test lab while telling us that it's safe. He's not satisfied that this is the case. So you have a kind of reaction against it. And the question is Israel actually destroying itself? Critics of the vaccine process say that repeated doses of it compromise our natural immune system, make us more susceptible to common diseases, as well as encouraging spread of variants. If this is true, then the vaccination process may be putting Israel's population in great danger. So if you think about Israel in danger, this is an area where I feel really concerned that Israel is putting itself in danger by going through with this program. There really isn't any political will not to do it, but it's something which many Israelis are really reacting against now, and there's a growing movement which is saying no to it all. Okay, the second danger. Let's move on. The Palestinian state. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, he has made a public statement that he's ruled out the possibility of Israel accepting the need for a Palestinian state. He said that, I oppose a Palestinian state. I think it would be a grave mistake to import the failed model of Gaza and Hamas, which shoots rockets at us, and turn the entire West Bank into that. In my opinion, the Palestinian Authority is a failed entity, particularly as the Palestinian Authority is glorifying terrorists, putting money to terrorists who've killed Israelis and families of martyrs. He's also said his opposition to reopening of the US General Consulate in East Jerusalem, saying Jerusalem is the capital of the State of Israel and no other country. So Bennett's actually saying something which is quite strong here, that he doesn't want to work towards the establishment of a Palestinian state. If you know anything about Israeli politics, that is quite significant, because the world actually wants Israel to move forward in the name of peace to the establishing a Palestinian state on the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Saying, no, Palestinians are not up to it. We will not have a Palestinian state on our borders, because what's happened when we pulled out of Gaza, what did we get? We got terrorists firing missiles into Israel. If they were going to do that from the West Bank, they've got the whole of the populated area of Israel in view, and it would probably mean the end of Israel. So there's a real issue concerning this. And he said, Jerusalem's the capital of the State of Israel, of no other country. So he's making a statement on this Jerusalem issue. We're going to keep control over Jerusalem. Now, the very minimum demand which the Palestinians have is that they should have a Palestinian state with Jerusalem, East Jerusalem as its capital, and that Israel should move out of the areas of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. So this is a picture of the United Nations General Assembly, and you can't see it very well, but the man speaking there is the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, not speaking in person, but by internet website. He's actually accused Israel of apartheid. He's threatened to withdraw recognition of Israel unless it withdraws from Palestinian Authority territory in 1 year. And he's actually saying he's going to pull the plug on the peace process and move towards confrontation with Israel. Now, Abbas himself is 85 years old. He's not popular at all with his people, and it's quite unlikely that he's going to continue for much longer. If he does go, then there is a great danger for Israel that Hamas the terrorist group in Gaza will take over. Basically, most of the Palestinians today have no faith in what they call the peace process. They have no real desire to make a peace with Israel. They want to rip up the Oslo Accords, which were signed in 1993, which set off the whole peace program. And they've said that basically they want to replace not just Israeli rule in Judea and Samaria, but in the whole of the area. One of the statements from the old PLO was, "Peace for us means the destruction of Israel." So the peace which they really want is the end of Israel. They don't really recognize Israel's right to exist, and the Hamas program is that the whole place should be whole of Israel should be dismantled basically and replaced with a Palestinian state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Israel naturally doesn't want that to happen, but the message of delegitimization of Israel is not just happening from Hamas, it also comes from the Palestinian Authority. And the next one tells us how this is a imam in the mosque of the Temple Mount. He says that Muslims are going to purify Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, and liberate the land and the people from the defilement of the criminal infidels, that's the Jews. Jews defile and desecrate the Al-Aqsa Mosque by visiting the Temple Mount. He's called on Muslims to purify the Temple Mount and liberate the land and the people from the defilement of the criminal infidels. So the idea that Jews want to rebuild the temple there is anathema to them, and that the land must be cleansed and purified from the defilement of modern Israel. This is a quote. He says directly, "The nation of truth and justice, the nation of Islam, will have a decisive victory, and that the nation of Islam will be crowned with the purification of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the liberation of the land, and Allah will prepare a man for us who will follow the path of the rightly guided caliphs, who will liberate the land and the people from the defilement of the criminal infidels." So you've got this constant propaganda, especially coming from the mosques, that Israel has to be completely driven out of the land and destroyed. They also say that the Israelis want to rebuild a third temple on the Temple Mount, and therefore that's a threat to Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. So if you think about that, what was I saying earlier about Zechariah and prophecy? It says that Jerusalem is going to be the burdensome stone. You have these two forces coming together with totally different agendas, and Israel is in the middle of it. And so today you've got this kind of propaganda against Israel, which is growing all the time. Israel also has a problem within Israel because the Arab population is increasingly facing kind of disintegration within its own communities, not just politically, but also because of crime, drugs, and all this kind of things which are going on. So Israel's facing a real problem with its Arab relations with the Arab people, which is a threat again to Israel's survival. Okay, the next point. Israel has two failed states on its borders, Syria and Lebanon. Both are a strategic threat to Israel because Lebanon has been taken over basically by Hezbollah, who are armed from Iran with missiles pointing at Israel. And Syria also has Iranian forces moving into the Syrian area. And facing Israel, this is on the Golan Heights. I went to the Golan Heights last time I was in Israel. And from the Golan Heights you can see right into Syria. It's only 40 miles from there to Damascus. And in the area just on the other side, in the Syrian side, Iranian forces have been moving in and taking control of villages right along the border there. Why are they taking control of those villages, that area? Because they want to use it as a springboard from there to attack Israel. So right now the Iranians are preparing for an attack on Israel just beyond the top of that picture. You can see into Syria. That area is being taken over by Iranians. And use it as a future springboard for an attack upon Israel. So you have Iran moving into that area, and you have America moving out. America is now making some kind of peace deals with Iran, with their nuclear facilities. America is less reliable to defend Israel. And Israel is feeling more and more vulnerable with the situation there. If you go on to the next slide, it shows Iranian general, a man called General Hossein Salami, who's the chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. He made the aims of the Iranian regime pretty clear. He said, our strategy is to remove Israel from the global political map. So that's what they're there for, and that's what their foreign policy is all about. The big question for Israel is over Iran's nuclear program. And the Iranian government makes no secret of the fact that it is working on a nuclear program which aims at the production of nuclear weapons. It says here, Iran's progress towards developing nuclear weapons has led the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, to speed up its operational plans. The military said that Major General Tal Karman, the head of the Iran file, is at work on an operational plans to attack Iran's nuclear program, as well as its missile and rockets sites. So if you look there, there's Iran, it's got all those missile sites, and Israel is planning or talking about the possibility of mounting an attack upon them. Already Israeli cyber attacks have taken place, and there have been mysterious explosions and fires in some of those places all over Iran. And there's a kind of low-grade war which is already taking place. If it becomes a high-grade war and Israel hits the Iranian nuclear facilities, could set off a major war in the region. Yeah, so there's the Iran working towards a nuclear weapon. Some people reckon Iran is only about a month away from being able to produce a nuclear weapon. So if that's the case, and Israel says, well, we're not going to let them go any further, we're going to attack them and destroy the nuclear facilities, then Israel could mount an attack any time now on Iranian nuclear facilities. So you've got all these things taking place, and if that happens, then Iran would no doubt strike back. So you could set off a war in the region. Does that have anything to do with Bible prophecy? I think it does. 26 centuries ago, Ezekiel described a last days alliance that would invade Israel from the north. The Bible says that a man called Gog will lead this massive invasion force, and there are nations which are going to join with him. So you have an invasion force coming from the north against Israel. Most people believe that the leader of this army is actually Gog, leader who comes from Meshech and Tubal, and from the far north, the uttermost parts of the north. Prince of Rosh, it's described as. If you go as far north as you can from Israel, from Jerusalem, you actually get to Moscow. Moscow is on the same latitude as Jerusalem. So go dead north from Jerusalem, and you come to Moscow. So how could Russia get involved? Well, right now Russia is involved in Syria. It's got its forces in Syria. It's allied to Iran. If Israel was to attack Iran, then Russia would actually have to do something to come against Israel. You have Magog. Now there's a bit of I took this from somebody else's work, actually, not mine, but Magog may not be those countries, but it may be. They're actually the southern republics of the former Soviet Union, including Afghanistan. I'm not sure if Afghanistan would be part of the invasion force, but certainly you have a group of countries there which are Muslim, could be allied to Russia, could come against Israel. You have Persia, which is definitely Iran. That one we can be totally sure about. You have Kush, which may be Sudan, Put, which may be Libya. And you have Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah, which are pro-slightly Turkey. Now, if you think those countries have nothing to do with it, well, in the past 2 decades, Russia and Iran have become close allies. Russia is one of the few world powers that consistently defended the existence of Iran's nuclear program and has been working with them on it. Turkey used to be an ally of Israel, was pro-Western, and it made a dramatic shift in the last 10 years. Turkish President Erdogan slowly become consolidating power in Turkey and changing it from a secular government into an Islamic one, an Islamic republic, which is coming against Israel. There's a strong relationship between Russia's Vladimir Putin and Erdogan, and also Iran is coming into the play there. These three countries have met several times recently to discuss cooperation among their nations, Iran, Turkey and Russia. See those three countries coming together. It's significant, it's not just an accident. And if you follow the Bible prophecies, all these things are pushing us towards the war of Gog and Magog as described in the Bible. And one possibility that what might trigger this conflict would be a first strike by Israel against Iran's nuclear program, which would lead to some kind of response from Iran, which would bring Russia into it and could bring the armies coming now against Israel into some attack upon Israel. When it happens, then God's going to intervene. So let's have a look at some of the prophecies which speak about it. Ezekiel 38, verses 1 to 12. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Prophesy against him and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and lead you out with all your army. After many days you will be visited. In the latter years you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains, which long had been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. You will ascend, coming like a storm, covering the land like a cloud, you and all your troops, and many peoples with you. It says specifically this army comes from the north, from the direction of Syria, Lebanon, into the land of people who've been brought back from the sword and gathered from many people to the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. So it speaks about a time when the Jews have been brought back from many nations, back to live in the land of Israel, back to a land which had once been desolate. It also speaks about this happening in the last days, in the latter years, and many of the prophecies in the Bible speak about this particular period as when the Jewish people return, it'll be in the latter days or in the last days. Hebrew phrase be'acharit hayamim, which is a phrase which is a trigger for telling you that this is the last days before the coming again of the Messiah, of Yeshua. One thing which people say is, well, it says they're going to be living safely. So Israel's not living safely, so that rather scuppers it. But interestingly, the Hebrew word is betach, which means with security. So the understanding is that Israel will have some kind of a security system itself, which it does have. It has anti-missile missiles, it has a strong army, has alliances with other nations. But although it has its kind of security base, when this comes, it won't be enough to stand against this army which is coming against them. When the army comes, there's going to be a protest which is going to be made against it. It says, one of the things it says is they're going to come back to take a plunder. So in Ezekiel 38, verse 13, says, Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all their young lions say to you, have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry away silver and gold, to take away silver, livestock and goods, to take great plunder? So this army is coming away not just to attack Israel, but also to take plunder for something. People have speculated what the plunder might be. Is it resources in the Dead Sea? I don't think that could be the case. One interesting thing which has happened in recent months is that, or recent years, is that Israel discovered a large amount of oil and natural gas off its coast near Lebanon, off the coast of Haifa in the north. So you have this spoil, if you like, from the which would be of interest, particularly to Russia. Why would it be of interest to Russia? Because, as I was saying earlier, one of the problems which you have in Europe in particular is a lack of resources, lack of gas. Most of the natural gas comes from Russia, which is Russia's main source of income. Israel has right now discovered this natural gas off its coast. It's gone into alliance with Cyprus, with Greece, also with Egypt, and is laying a pipeline which will go from that area through Cyprus, through Greece, to Italy to supply the European Union with gas, which would be a great benefit for Israel, but Russia would see that as a kind of taking away from their supply. So Russia could have an interest. Russia actually wanted to get control of this area at one point. They offered some deal to the Israelis said no. So one possibility of why they would come down, one interest would be in taking a plunder. Now we don't know that for sure, but it's kind of another interesting development. It speaks also about Sheba and Dedan, who are resisting this attack upon Israel. So they're not on the side of the invading army, they're questioning it. Sheba and Dedan are the Gulf Arab states on the Persian Gulf which have recently made an alliance with Israel. United Arab Emirates and other areas round about there, including possibly even Saudi Arabia. So you're finding because these countries which are Sunni Muslims, they're opposed to Iran, so they've come into a kind of alliance with Israel. So you have this another interesting kind of line that you've got some countries, some Arab countries which seem to be on Israel's side. Another point is you see that in the build-up of countries coming against Israel, you don't see any sign of Egypt or of Jordan or of other countries which have previously been hostile to Israel. They're all countries coming from the north against Israel. Also, you have Tarshish and the young lions. Now, again, there's a question mark about where Tarshish is. According to one interpretation, Tarshish was a place on the extreme west as far as the Israelis were concerned, or ancient Israel was concerned, round about Spain. So it could be Spain, but more likely could also be Great Britain. How do you work that out? Well, the merchants did come all the way up to Cornwall and to southern Britain to get goods in the time of Phoenicia and so on, and they could have called Tarshish this place. If that's the case, then Britain plus its young lions, which would be the United States, so the countries of the Western Alliance which are opposed to the Russian invasion speak out against it. Now that's a bit speculative, and you might say, well, that's asking too much of it, but if you have that, then you have these countries which represent Israel's Arab allies, plus the Western countries, including the United States, Britain, who will say something, what have you come for? But they actually do nothing. They don't actually give any help to Israel. They just speak and speak against it. The next thing which happens, according to Ezekiel, is that God moves in and supernaturally destroys the invading army, which comes down from the north and saves Israel from destruction. Going on in Ezekiel, it says, it shall come to pass at that time when Gog comes against the land of Israel, says the Lord God, that my fury will show him my face. I will bring him to judgment with pestilence and bloodshed. I will rain down on him and on his troops and with many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Thus I will magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Okay, so when this army comes against Israel, something's going to happen which will be not just a natural kind of defense, but God is going to move in and save Israel from the army coming against them. So we have God intervening and saving Israel, and it says, then they will come to know the Lord. So there's something going to happen then which Israel will turn to God in thanksgiving. They may not necessarily turn to Jesus at this time. It depends when the war of Gog and Magog happens. Now, people who study Bible prophecy actually have two views about when Gog and Magog happens. Some people say it is the same as the War of Armageddon, so it's actually the last battle. In which case, what follows this is the second coming of Jesus to the earth. Others, including myself, actually say that it's not the same, it's a war which happens before that time. And it could happen in the not too distant future as well. And it precedes the 7-year period of the Great Tribulation. Because after the war of Gog and Magog, then you have somebody who comes along who makes a peace covenant with Israel. Now, we haven't yet seen a peace covenant with Israel, but it occurs to me that if you have this massive war which comes against Israel, and God intervenes and saves Israel, then what are the nations going to say? We have to make some kind of peace so this doesn't happen again. And it could be that out of this you have the 7-year covenant of Daniel chapter 9 verse 27. So 3 possibilities. What happens then? Israel turns to God, not necessarily to Jesus the Messiah yet. The Antichrist arises from a European alliance in the region of the former Roman Empire. He's backed by the United Nations, as you read in Revelation 13 and 17. He then makes a peace covenant with Israel, which is prophesied in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verse 27. It says, then he, the Antichrist, shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, period of 7 years. That's prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, which comes after the prophecy of Daniel 9:26, which speaks about the Messiah being cut off, not for himself, not for his own sins, but for the sins of others. Prophecy which was fulfilled in Jesus the Messiah. One of the most clear prophecies in the Old Testament, Daniel 9:26, speaks about Jesus as the Messiah suffering and dying. Then you have a strange sort of interval, which concludes with a 7-year period, which begins with he, the last person who's mentioned, who's the prince to come, who I take to be the Antichrist, making a covenant with Israel in the last 7 years for a period of 7 years. This is the peace treaty, which according to Isaiah then breaks down. It turns out to be a covenant with death, breaks down halfway through the 7-year period, and it leads to the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place and the final period of the Great Tribulation prophesied for the last days in Daniel 11 and 12 and in Matthew 24. So what about the abomination of desolation? Now, if you go back to the Ezekiel 38, in the course of the Gog and Magog war, it says there's going to be a great earthquake. And in verses 19 and 20, it speaks about an earthquake in the land of Israel, which causes the walls to fall to the ground. So which walls and what is the result of this earthquake? Now, it doesn't say this, but what occurs to me is that the earthquake which takes place brings down the building we saw at the beginning, the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, possibly also even the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, and those buildings are knocked down by this earthquake. If that happens, then there's a huge question, what do you do to rebuild? Do you rebuild the mosque? Do you rebuild what? And as a result of the fact that this was some kind of supernatural event which took place, and there's a kind of sympathy for Israel, the Antichrist moves in and says, well, you can rebuild your temple there, which is what Israelis want to do, some Israelis want to do right now. So this could be the thing which would open up the rebuilding of the temple. There are prophecies which indicate that in the last days that the Antichrist is going to cause the rebuilding of the temple. So when he does that, not because he wants to have the God of Israel worshipped, but because he wants to put his image in the place to be worshipped as the abomination of desolation. So if that's in place, then the next thing which happens is he puts in the abomination of desolation, his image, placing there to be worshipped of himself as God. Jewish people realize they've been deceived and flee from the scene, and the final period of the Great Tribulation begins. So this could be, now again, you could say this is all speculation, and I realize it hasn't happened yet. I'm reading into the prophecies a possible series of events, but I think it is one which does tie in with what's happening now and is possible to take place. Out of it, there comes now a new crisis for Israel. As they see this abomination standing in the holy place, they see that the temple, which they hoped was going to be their temple to the Lord, is now a place where something evil is being worshipped, and many of them flee. But Zechariah chapter 12 verse 10 says that at this time it will also cause the last war, which will bring the armies of the world against Jerusalem. Zechariah 12 verse 10 says that at that time God's going to pour out his Spirit upon them, and as he pours out his Spirit upon them, they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, it says, and mourn for him as for an only son, and grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. So the Spirit of grace and supplication is poured out upon them. What Spirit is that? That's the Holy Spirit. They look upon me, whom they have pierced. So who is me? He's speaking here. Me who has been pierced. Who could have died by having his hands and his feet pierced? Sometime before this happens. So at this point they have a revelation of Jesus as one who's been pierced, who died for their sins by crucifixion. And they look unto him and they believe that he is the Messiah. They believe that he is, they mourn for him as for a son, grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. So the revelation of Jesus Christ comes there at the end, and then that leads to the final time of the armies coming, of trouble coming, but of Jesus returning in person. And in chapter 14 he says, I will gather all nations to battle against Jerusalem. That really is Armageddon. Then in 13 it says, then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. In that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. Mount of Olives shall be split in two. And then it says, thus the Lord my God will come, and all the saints, all the holy ones, with him. So the final point of this climax, which, as far as I'm concerned, definitely is going to happen. Some of the things I've said are, they're possible interpretation. This is what will happen, for sure, is that the Messiah is going to come at this final point, who is Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah. Says his feet are going to stand on the Mount of Olives. He says he's going to come with all the holy ones with him, with the saints. So those who've been called up to meet with him before, come back with him. Those who've died before, come back with him in glorified bodies. He then takes his rule as leader, as the Lord over all the earth. It says then, the Lord will be king over all the earth, and his name one, and the Lord is one, and his name one. So it says that Jesus is going to then again rule over all the earth, which will be the final time when he begins his messianic reign, brings peace and justice to the world for 1,000 years. And Jerusalem and the temple will then be rebuilt in the millennial kingdom and become the center of the final good world government of the Messiah. And that, I believe, is definitely going to happen. That Jesus is going to come back, he's going to rule from Jerusalem, bring peace and justice to the earth. A lot of scriptures tell you about that. And today we can see the scene being set for that to happen. And what I said at the beginning of the talk speaks about a time of trouble for Israel. But out of that time of trouble will come the revelation of Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah. Time of trouble will be not just for Israel, it will be for the whole world. It will be a time of great tribulation. And at that time, the only hope will be the second coming of Jesus. Only question I haven't left, which I'm not going to discuss in great detail, is where does the rapture come? Before, in the middle, or at the end? It'll happen one of those times, so be ready for it, and hope that when Jesus comes, and I believe it is before, by the way, that you're ready for Jesus to come. But when you see these things beginning to happen, as they are beginning to happen, then you have to know that the end of the story is going to happen as well. Jesus is going to come. So believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved. And recognize that we live in exciting times. Though there are bad times and all sorts of bad stuff's happening, it's all preparing us for the second coming of Jesus, Yeshua HaMashiach, the Messiah and Saviour of Israel. And he's going to come and he's going to take up his rule as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And then the kingdoms of this world will become the kingdom of our God, of his Messiah, and he shall reign forever and ever. Praise the Lord.